Tony, I'd like to ask you about your virtual water concept, really as a kind of intellectual innovation. But before I start and give some ideas about that, I'd like to ask you, what's your kind of, your idea, your thought about what innovation means in the study of water policy around the world?
Well, there's a tendency in most water policymakers to concentrate on the physical water and not on the politics. And since my journey has been from that side, and as I've worked more abroad and even in this country, I find that the role of politics is so important that it's essential that we try to get scientists not to be brilliant political scientists, but to be aware that announcing the truth is not enough. It's got to be announced and shared in a way which is communicable and welcome. And but because the thing that's impressed me, I've come across over the years many managing directors of consulting water engineering companies, and they weren't in that position until quite a way through their career, certainly 20 years or more. And during the first 20 years, they were doing very technical things, and then they had to learn how to think politically, both because they were in private sector organizations. They had to be taking so many other things into account, the budget and various other things, and they could quite easily do it, but they weren't encouraged to think about it in the early parts of their career, and that's I thought, both in the professional world as well as in the academic world, it was a pity that there was not some awareness amongst the engineering community that there were political factors to take into account that could stop everything.
And in your own career, having come from, geography, but still, in the sort of sciences part of it, did you have to go through that journey yourself? Where were you at when you started with the virtual water idea, and have you changed your kind of orientation? Are you more interdisciplinary than you were?
Well, I've always been, and if you're going to do water in development, certainly you've got to be aware of the economics, and you've got to be aware of the hydrology, you've got to be aware of the politics. From my first, when I came back into the university world, I had to adjust to that. What I have discovered over the intervening sort of 50 years almost, that because one is a generalist and not a specialist, and you're always engaged with specialists, you've got to be able to offer connections which matter. Otherwise, you're always in this subordinate position of being a second-rate economist or a second-rate hydrologist and so on. So I've had to, it isn't, having the label geographer is a big disadvantage. That I'm Tony Allen, that's made a contribution to water thinking is significant. I can go into meetings with that, but if I was to be measured by my competence in economics and hydraulic engineering, I would find it hard to get a hearing.
And how have you managed then to make those kind of intellectual connections yourself between these different areas that you have to address?
I think it's just by partly as anything that you do, you need a bit of courage. If you've got to be prepared to knock on doors, and if you need an answer to a question and you know that it's in the mind of the person in that organization, you've just got to have the courage to go and persuade them that it's necessary to there would be a productive result from this encounter. So I'm in a position now that one goes to any meeting and I'm able to converse in the relative, in the necessary standards of economics, political economy, and water science and engineering. That it is a progressive conversation. So there is a, if I've been lucky and been in long enough to become a reasonably successful interdisciplinarian, but that is, and sometimes people, as I indicated when I talked about senior engineers becoming managing directors and CEOs, they have to suddenly become interdisciplinarians, because there's one thing about the private sector. It doesn't, I mean, if you get big corporations, they can be in silos, but if you're going to solve a problem in the private sector, you've got to get on and do it, and and relate to the issues that count. You can't say, just because I'm interested in this is where the solution lies. That is one good thing about having an early career in geography, is that you pick up the idea that the answer will not necessarily be in economics or hydraulic engineering. It might be in something completely different, and one feels entitled to go into those other areas.
Mm-hmm. And so you have, a prize-winning idea associated with your name, as you've said, and you've hinted at the sort of impact of it maybe being not just in one field, but how do you kind of see it in your own terms? Is it a kind of incremental development of something that was already there, say in Marxist ideas or other places, or was it a real breakthrough? And if so, how do you understand that yourself?
No, I grafted on the Marxist ideas afterwards, because they obviously the idea was a bit like embedded labour, which is something which was, since the value of labour inputs wasn't valued in a Marxian sense, and clearly the environment wasn't very much valued at all at that stage, but because of the political efforts, then labour value was in fact addressed, and not a fair system put in place, but a much better system. So all I was saying for a time, and as I said, I could say it with, this was the second failure of capitalism, but unfortunately capitalism fails in different ways over labour and the environment in different ways over centuries.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that the idea has had more impact in, say, some areas of practice or some areas of academia than others? You've hinted at, there were critiques in economics and so on. Where do you think it's had the most impact? Well,
just in a general understanding that water isn't where you thought it was. That if you think that water is just in the suitcase of water, as I talked about, then that's a very weak analytical position to be in.